And we will be talking a lot in this week's program about the media, as we have been. And there are a couple aspects of today's media culture, for lack of a better word, that our next guest has written about and thought about. So I'm looking forward to speaking with him. Alan McLeod joins us from Edinburgh, Scotland. He is a writer. He is a member of the Glasgow University Media Group. His latest book, Bad News from Venezuela, set 20 years of fake news and misreporting, was published in April of last year, and he joins us now. So first of all, Alan, thanks for coming on the program. Secondly, I'm hoping you heard us there. We had a glitch. Secondly, you wrote a piece recently published in FAIR, which is Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, if I recall correctly. Excellent website and organization, fair.org. On the homeless 8-year-old chess champion and other horrific, quote unquote, uplifting stories. So I guess I'll start with this, Alan. What inspired you to write this piece? Was it this particular story about the chess champion?
Yeah, for sure. So I think we're all pretty much familiar with this genre of light-hearted stories that come on at the end of your news show, stories like, I don't know, this autistic teen won a NASA scholarship, or hey, check out this disabled dog with a new prosthetic limb, look at her go. But there's now an increasing subgenre of these stories that are meant to be uplifting, but are actually horrifying when you start thinking about them for more than 5 minutes or even 20 seconds. And they really reveal how the majority of working class people are forced to live. And so this 8-year-old homeless chess champion story was just the catalyst for it. I've actually been saving these up for quite a while. In the 8-year-old chess champion story, it's revealed that a Nigerian immigrant who is homeless is now the New York chess champion for his age. And it talks about his wonderful attacking style, his refugee status, but it never once asked the question, well, why in one of the richest cities and one of the richest countries in the world can children be homeless at all? And there are tons of stories about this that I've been noticing in the last few months. For instance, there was one about a good Samaritan in Chicago who saved up money and spent it on hotel rooms for homeless people during the recent polar vortex. And that's a really great thing to do. But buried in the story, in the reporting on CBS, was the clear assumption that these homeless people would have died if she didn't do that. And there's absolutely no talk about how horrific this is, this bigger story that people's human rights, the right to a home, the right to water or a decent standard of living are not considered rights, but in fact are commodities to be bought and sold on the market. And that's really what I was trying to get at with these stories, that the media is so out of touch, so blind to the suffering of the population that some of these stories they present as uplifting are actually really quite enraging and show how cruel our system is.
Yeah, these stories in one form or another have been around for a while, and you put your finger on it in your FAIR piece. It's something that, occasionally somebody would point out at work or something to me. Look at this wonderful story of this, homeless person, and somebody gave them a carpet for when they're crawling along the ground because they're too hungry to stand or whatever it is. That, I would always say, geez, but that's a terrible situation. And I think what your story helped crystallize for me is, you might call it, is that I think these stories are very ideological, but it's a kind of covert ideology. I think it's an ideology that says, well, for example, your example, it's a Nicholas Kristof column, chess champion will make you smile. Look at that plucky little guy. This 8-year-old doesn't let homelessness get him down, and that's supposed to make you smile, where there's an ideology in there to me, but I want your thoughts on it. And the ideology, and it's meant to be imparted in me when I read it, or when people talk about it, is he didn't let his circumstances get him down. The inverse of that being that if anyone is really suffering from homelessness, which presumably this kid is too when he's not being written about, uh, it's their fault. It's not society's fault. It's the fault of the individual. And I think the through line or the thread connecting all these stories is, it's not society's fault. It's that where was the nice guy to prevent these people from freezing on the street in Chicago, to use your example? You also mentioned a government worker so disabled she has to pawn her wedding ring, and it's just so sweet because I guess her family bought it back for her. But it's supposed to be, look at that nice family and never look at the situation where we let this government worker get furloughed and she had to sell or pawn her wedding ring. So to me, it's always absolving society of the responsibilities a society should hold. But what do you think of that interpretation?
100%. I mean, I suppose that 8-year-old kid should have worked harder in preschool, and then he wouldn't have been homeless.
Right.
That's how the media present it in a way. It's this sort of bootstrap mentality where if you really want it, you can succeed. And there's lots of examples of worker works X miles in the snow to his new job, worker works 10 miles, 15 miles, etc. And very often the words, it's an example to us all, or there are no excuses is another one that comes through in all of these. And what it's subtly saying is that this is now the new standard of how working class people have to do. This is the sort of exploitation they have to accept if they want to have a job, if they want to get on in the US. Um, when people say, this is an example to us all, when a worker has to spend hours of his day walking, I mean, I have to think, is it an example of a broken public transport system or an
Mm.
example of what we should do? And that's really the ideology that just comes dripping through these reportings. And that's what I was trying to get at. It's this refined bootstrapism that the media presents to us.
And Adam, you have one paragraph in here that I'm going to read. It's a short paragraph, but as a perfect example of, and then we can get to the seriousness of it. But the black humor nature sometimes of this, which you quote Adam Johnson, one of the other folks at FAIR, saying, it's perseverance porn. But People magazine picked up a story about the wife of an 85-year-old McDonald's cleaner with two disabled grandsons who died in the restaurant's toilets, and how the local community rallied around to pay for her funeral. The story was covered by the Washington Post, many news outlets, and also the website Sunny Skies, whose tagline is Live, Laugh, Love. Not a lot to laugh about in that story. So I guess the question is, are we being is this sort of the dark side of the gig economy? Is it like you're on your own and that's it?
Well, that's definitely the message of it, frankly. That story about the McDonald's worker was also picked up by inspirestory.com. And so it's clear that there is a section of the media that seems to think that these stories are wonderful. And to be clear, there are often aspects of these stories, the perseverance, the generosity, the human spirit, that are certainly remarkable and worth thinking about. But they happen within a neoliberal framework that is really a window into the absolute hell that a lot of people are living in. Half of the country does not have basically any money. They're almost completely broke. People are suffering under huge debts from college tuition or medical expenses. And this is the sort of life they have to live, where they are completely at the mercy of the community. They're completely at the mercy of the system, where an 85-year-old with two disabled grandchildren can be out on the streets if he doesn't keep cleaning the toilets where his wife died.
Right. It's just so heartbreaking. And I want to point out another pair of stories that you focused on, and that's paying for education and healthcare. CNN shared the story of the inspiring, quote unquote, Ryan Hickman, who, this is insane to me, Alan McLeod, I just have to say that, who at just 3 years old began recycling trash to help pay for college. After 3.5 years, CNN noted, Hickman had saved $11,000, a sum that covers less than one-fifth of a year's basic undergraduate tuition at his local University of Southern California. And another, a North Carolina kid with a can-do attitude who did the same, barely making $3 a week. Neither network asks why children have to literally wade through garbage to hope for a decent education in the richest country in world history. This country outlawed child labor a century ago, give or take, and yet we have these children forced, if they're going to have a better future, to labor at an unimaginably young age, and we have the news media celebrating for them. Why do you suppose now, I called it hidden in ideology, but I would assume that the writers of these stories don't see themselves as writing ideological stories. So how is it, do you suppose, that they manage to convince themselves that these are lovely, uplifting stories that need to be shared and go viral?
Well, they say that fish don't realize they're swimming in the sea. And likewise, people are just so drenched in ideology. Journalists are pre-selected from a group of upper middle class people in the US. And that pre-selected group is then refined as you go up and up the scale. And so by the time you get to national journalists, they've really learned the ropes and they have internalized the internal corporate nature of journalism and the industry. And I have to say that being an outsider to the US, it is crazy how much of an outlier the US is in terms of college education. As somebody who paid $1,900 or so to go to his country's most prestigious university and felt completely ripped off and livid about it, so much that we went on protests to try and reduce the cost back down to zero. I have to say that thinking about 3-year-olds literally wading through garbage just to be able to afford to go to college is really quite shocking.
Yeah, and it's such an important perspective because, of course, we're told in this country that any other way of life than this one is just not practical and not feasible, and you're just dreaming if you think that life can be other than this. And yet, of course, in virtually every other developed nation on Earth, life is exactly what we're being told is impossible. Now, you also, along those lines of what we don't have that every other developed country has. You write, a local KTSM El Paso anchor smiled as she said, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. And then went on to talk about a sweet story, quote unquote, of a 6-year-old girl who set up a lemonade stand to help pay for her mother's chemotherapy. Honestly, I almost cried when I read this supposedly sweet story. What could possibly be more heartwarming? A different 6-year-old setting up a lemonade stand to help pay for her own chemotherapy. Now, this, I assume, is equally incomprehensible to someone coming from a developed country that is not the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. That last story you mentioned about the 6-year-old paying for her own chemotherapy was really the one that inspired me to write the story, I think. I am reminded of that new Canadian Breaking Bad joke about how it's never set in Canada because otherwise they would say, I'm afraid, Mr. White, it's cancer. Your treatment starts next week, free of charge.
Right, right. True, true. No, that's absolutely right. Not a lot of drama and a strong social safety net, but I suppose it would create a loss of content, which could be a problem for local news anchors. But as you say, if they lived in New Zealand, Norway, or Nova Scotia, none of this would be necessary due to free healthcare. Something else that, by the way, that we're told in this country is impossible. Well, are you continuing to collect these stories? Has it become kind of I know when I do something like that, it sort of becomes a compulsion and I can't stop sort of bookmarking them or saving them. Have you been able to exorcise this particular demon from your own news reading?
Unfortunately, I think there's going to be a lot more of these stories coming, so I think I'm going to have to start bookmarking them as well.
Yeah, well, maybe you'll come back and give us a horrific recap of the next round. But I wanted to talk to you, and again, we're talking with Adam McLeod, who is a writer and a member of the Glasgow University Media Group. You wrote another piece just the other day, which I also found interesting, entitled "There Will Be No Repercussions for the Media's Russiagate Conspiracy Theorists." Now we will be, and we have been talking on this show about the Russiagate story and what we know at this point about the Mueller report, which is essentially no sign of collusion between the Trump administration and the Russian government. Now, we were fed a steady diet of news reports telling us that it was only a matter of time until Robert Mueller uh, frog marched Donald Trump out of the White House, even though Mueller had indicated as his own standard, one I don't share, by the way, that a sitting president can't be indicted. But we were also told that it was an open shut case, that there was in fact collusion, and that Trump was Putin's asset in the White House, weren't we?
Yeah, absolutely. We don't know exactly what the content of the Mueller report is just now, but from the summary that the Attorney General released, Donald Trump has claimed complete exoneration. And certainly the Democratic aligned media like MSNBC have gotten extremely quiet on the subject. Rachel Maddow, I was watching, she spent about 15 seconds talking about the charge of no collusion, which was found, and then she moved on, switched the goalpost to we have to see the full report, let's have it released. But certainly MSNBC and much of the media has been feeding its viewership a steady stream of this, in fact, more of a torrent of this story for the past 2.5 years now. And it's looking increasingly like it's going to lead to a big fat nothing, frankly. And what's really worrying about this is that with only, well, less than 2 years to the presidential election, it seems like the liberal media is going to hand Donald Trump a huge shield which he can protect himself with from any criticism, because he can just say, remember the Mueller report, this is fake news.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there are multiple dimensions to this story, which is why we're giving it so much attention here. But one of them is certainly, in my opinion anyway, that this guy, Trump, is corrupt in some very conspicuous ways. And I hold myself to a high standard of evidence, but I think there's, good evidence to suggest that he's done bad things, corrupt things, immoral things, but that being an agent of the Putin regime, or what, to use the language of the day, media language of the day, is not one of them. That by selling people for 2 years on the narrative that this was all going to be proven, that he was going to be in an orange jumpsuit soon, or taken out in handcuffs, and that everything that has gone wrong with the country, including and especially the loss of the presidency by Hillary Clinton to Donald Trump, could be attributed to Russia's nefarious dealings, that this was the wrong narrative to go after Trump with. And now that, from what we can infer from the Barr statement, which Robert Mueller is not challenged, uh, he's not going to ask for any more arrests. That's not exoneration per se, but that he found no evidence of collusion. And so if that goes away, because the other thing that Democrats and media critics of Trump did was place full faith in Robert Mueller. So if Mueller says he's not going to indict anybody else and he found no evidence of collusion, then the foundation they chose to base their anti-Trump narrative on goes away, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's little doubt in my mind that Donald Trump is one of the most corrupt people to ever take seat in the White House. they could have, on day one, have got him on the emoluments clause, for instance. His family still control all his businesses across the world, which is a clear conflict of interest. But instead, and the real reason that I'm so critical of the media is that instead of focusing on this or any of Trump's catastrophic policies, which are really harming the US and the rest of the countries in the world, thinking about his foreign policy in the Middle East or in Venezuela, or his gutting of the local education system, or his attacks on the environment, all of these could have been the substantive critique of Trump that the media could have been putting out. But my speculation is that the reason that they're not attacking him for this and have gone after him on Russia is that secretly much of the corporate media actually agree with Trump on tax reductions and his education reforms and all of that. And so it's really this. I don't want to use the word conspiracy theory, but it's really this narrative about Russia that has allowed the media to actually find something that they disagree with Trump on that they can attack him for.
Well, and I also think, and now you work with fairness and accuracy in reporting, and they do great work in this area. But I think you're right, and I also think there's a feeder system. There's a kind of media ecosystem of sources inside and outside the government, current and past officials, and so on. And I think those sources have some interests they're promoting here. One, many of them going into the defense industry, the national security contracting industry upon leaving government. Two, both ideologically and in terms of self-interest and in terms of bureaucratic interest. My personal feeling is a lot of these sources want to make sure that tensions remain extremely high with Russia. And in that sense, the narrative that they have promoted actually has helped them a great deal, because Trump, who originally talked about downgrading our tensions with Russia, which after all is another nuclear power, that in fact Trump has been extremely bellicose, and there's been some writing about that he hasn't, and I think that may be an outcome of the constant narrative that he's Putin's puppet. But I don't know, what do you think?
I think you're onto something there. It really is amazing that the Democratic aligned media has been outflanking Trump on foreign policy from the right and almost goading him into extremely dangerous actions. As you said, Russia is a nuclear power. The US and Russia have many times come within inches of nuclear Armageddon, whether it's intentionally, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, or unintentionally, like all these false alarms from the early warning systems that malfunction all the time. And so pushing Trump into a more bellicose position with regards to Russia, for instance, funding these far-right separatist groups in Ukraine, or bombing aerodromes in Syria where Russian troops are stationed, these could lead to a serious escalation of the war, and that could have terrible consequences for both the US, Russia, and the rest of the world. So it's a very dangerous game they're playing.
I couldn't agree more. And again, we're talking with Alan McLeod, who is an academic and a writer, and writes for, among other places, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. Some of us have been talking about this for a while. I know I myself, in December of 2016, wrote, "While Democrats chase Russians, Republicans keep rigging elections," which gets me to the other point that I think has been a tragic loss in this focus on Russia, is that just recently in the elections in November of last year, it's quite clear, at least to me, based on the evidence, that had it not been for election rigging on the part of Republicans at the state level, Democrats would have won the governorships of both Georgia and Florida. Instead, both those governorships were taken from them through the kind of voter suppression that Republicans have been getting away with for a long time. So, in other words, this fixation, this media fixation on the integrity of our elections, election integrity is a fine thing. I'm all for it. But both the Democrats and the media have fixated on one, what I would argue, relatively minor factor, which is whatever, social media ads or presences or bots were generated by the Russians, and not the massive impact of Republicans passing laws and taking other measures, for example, to prevent black people from voting around the country. So that, to me, too, is an example. You know, we were talking about the perseverance porn stories earlier, but this, to me, is an example, too, of how unconscious or conscious ideology affects reporting, that people are obsessed with the idea that perhaps Russian trolls ran some Facebook ads that were seen by 0.003%, I believe, according to one estimate, of Facebook viewers, but not at all concerned with absolute voter caging, voter suppression of other kinds, making it impossible for people in majority African American areas to vote and so on, by locating polls inconveniently, closing them early, and so on. A whole litany of efforts to really violate democracy in the worst way gets minimal to no coverage by comparison. So isn't that media bias too?
I think the focus on the stories about Russian bots, Russian hacking, etc., do give a lot of people into the center right, a convenient excuse to why they failed to beat Donald Trump, the most unpopular presidential candidate in modern history. It gives them an excuse. They don't have to look at their own failings. They don't have to look at Hillary Clinton's campaign, how she failed to really appeal to voters. She called 40% of the country, what was it, deplorable. She failed to run in Wisconsin and Michigan, etc. The Democrats have been for many decades really starting to abandon the working class in the United States, and really offered very little alternative to the Republican Party. And this fascination with Russia allows them to really just sort of provide them a convenient excuse where they don't have to look at their own failures or really start to reassess policy, and certainly not cede ground to the insurgent Sanders leftist wing of the party, who are calling for a much more populist, much more social democratic response to Trump.
Well, and in fairness to Hillary, she said they were a basket of deplorables, I believe, if I recall correctly. I wanted to write a show tune called "I've Got a Lovely Basket of Deplorables," but I never got around to it. So, okay, you know, I totally agree with you. I had hoped that the 2020 elections would show some of that sort of divisiveness and excuse making set aside, but I'm not seeing signs of this. As I look at the Democratic Party's internal debates, I still see people trying to suppress some of these challenges to the party's orthodoxy in much the same way as they were doing during the 2016 election. Now, they may not use collusion with Russia, quote unquote, per se, quite as much. But do you think that the Mueller report, I'm asking you to speculate here, but do you think that there's any chance that the Mueller report will actually, assuming that it does continue to say there's no evidence of collusion with Russia, will encourage the media, the Democratic media, let's say MSNBC and so on, as well as Democratic leaders themselves, to focus much more on policy, or do you expect more of the same, or is that yet to be known?
Well, I mean, the short answer is it's yet to be known, but we can look back at other mea culpas, or big conspiracies that the media has pushed. For instance, the Iraq War. Was there a great self-reflection period after the Iraq War when it was shown that there were no weapons of mass destruction? What I remember from it is that the media basically noted that there were no weapons of mass destruction, and then moved on to another topic and continued along with the same ideology. And so I think the chances are that actually there won't be this great policy shift where suddenly everybody's talking about substantive issues rather than personality, unfortunately.
Well, I think that's a very cogent observation and a very apt analogy to draw. Obviously, we have to wait and see, but and we're going to have to leave it there. But Alan McLeod, author of Bad News from Venezuela, 20 Years of Fake News and Misreporting, and also writer for Fairness and Accuracy in reporting. Thanks so much for your good work in this area, and thanks for coming on the program.
It was great to be here anytime.
Well, we'll have you back for sure.